Chapter 5. In a Dreadful State. The gigantic doors of the museum were flung open before Mr. Penguin could even knock the knocker or ring the bell. He and Colin were ushered into the entrance hall by a terribly efficient woman who shut the doors tight again, locked them and flung the large iron key into her handbag with a nervous, wobbly hand. Only then did she turn around and Mr. Penguin and Colin got their first look at Miss Boudicca Bones. She was a woman of a certain age and was nearly as wide as she was tall. In fact, she was much like a beach ball on legs, one wearing a neat little pair of court shoes and a pussy bow blouse in a powdered shrimp. She was obviously in a terrible flap, but her big red lips broke into a wide, relieved smile when she'd finished fiddling with the clasp on her handbag. "Mr. Penguin, my knight in shining armour," she cried as she led them out of the shadows and into the atrium with its domed glass ceiling. "Thank goodness you're here. Just look at the state of the place. I mean, just look. It's falling apart at the seams." Mr. Penguin and Colin stopped and looked around them. Miss Bones was right. The museum was in a dreadful state. Great chunks of plaster had crumbled off the walls. Framed pictures and notices had fallen off their hooks, and everything, including the gigantic dinosaur skeleton in the centre of the room, was covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like it'd been snowing indoors. It had been years since Mr. Penguin had last visited the museum, and he remembered it as a warm and sunny and full of people. But now, without any visitors and with mess everywhere, it was silent and shadowy and ever so slightly spooky. "What on earth happened?" gasped Mr. Penguin. "Age, I'm afraid," said Miss Bones sadly. "The museum is well over 200 years old, you see, and when one thing goes, everything else simply follows. Started with some tiles slipping off the roof, and now all this." Great tears bubbled up behind her spectacles as she fished down the front of her blouse for a lace-edged hanky. She dabbed at her eyes before blowing her nose loudly in it. It sounded like a foghorn. What my dear relatives would say if they could see it like this, I don't know. They'd be so disappointed in me, she sighed. Just then, the biggest man Mr. Penguin and Colin had ever seen came out of an upstairs room. He made his way down the staircase that wound around the atrium like a snail's shell. He must have been at least 7 foot tall and was squeezed into pinstripe slacks and a tie that looked like it was attempting to strangle him. He placed a hand the size of a frying pan on Miss Bones' shoulder and patted it gently. "This is my brother Montague," croaked Miss Bones in a husky voice. "We're both so glad you came to help us. Finding the lost treasure my great-great-great-grandpapa buried really is our last hope of fixing all this damage to the museum and bringing it back to its former glory. Without it, I'm afraid we'll be finished." "You're not the only ones," thought Mr. Penguin grimly. His mind wandered to the bills piling up at his igloo and the damp, draughty boat he'd be stuck on for weeks on the long journey back to the frozen south. He shook the thoughts from his head and stuck out his chest again. "Don't you worry," he said. "We'll sort all this out. We'll find the treasure for you." He flashed his best smile. Colin, there he is on the picture with his eyebrow. Colin wasn't quite so confident, but he smiled anyway. "I certainly hope so," said Miss Bones, stashing away her hanky. "Now let me show you the clues we've already found." "Oh, we found already." She led them all upstairs. Mr. Penguin waddled alongside her, bursting with excitement. A real treasure hunt with clues! This was brilliant! Colin followed behind, frowning to himself. Something about this empty museum was making him feel a bit goosepimply. It was as if they were being watched. And there's Colin, not looking very happy.